Trade has always sounded like something clean and innocent. For years, we were told the same story. Trade connects countries, lowers prices, makes everyone richer, and reduces the chance of war. It sounds nice, doesn't it? But when we look at history, things did not really work that way. Because trade was never truly free. It was always controlled by governments, navies, banks, and empires. Markets grew, cities became rich, and goods traveled across the world. But behind all of it, there was always power. Navies, states, financial systems, and powerful nations and individuals who made the rules. The thing called free trade almost always benefited the powerful. Even in modern times, we were told that trade had become neutral. They produce goods wherever it is cheapest, and everyone wins, they said. But when factories closed, when countries became dependent on foreign production, when industries started disappearing, they simply called it efficiency. In reality, the world was still revolving around power, because trade was never independent from politics. First it followed power, then came the theory. In the past, states did not see trade as a peaceful agreement. They saw it as a battlefield. The countries that controlled ports, trade routes, raw materials, and the seas became stronger and richer faster than everyone else. And between the 16th and 18th centuries, European empires did exactly that. Spain carried tons of silver from the Americas. Portugal tried to control the spice routes. The Dutch and the British created massive trading companies, but these were not ordinary companies. They could wage war, capture territory, and control trade routes. In other words, they used trade not to create economic prosperity, but to gain power. And even today, the world has not changed that much. Britain's Navigation Act showed how massive this system really was. Starting in the 1600s, Britain made it mandatory for most colonial trade to be carried out using British ships. The goal was simple. Trade was meant to enrich Britain, not its rivals. So this was not the free trade we are told about today. It was a system controlled through laws, agreements, and naval power. The colonies provided raw materials, while Britain sold manufactured goods back to them. The system was built for one reason, so the powerful would win. Today, people often describe global trade in a beautiful and idealistic way, but reality was never that simple. The first great global trade networks were not born from peace and freedom. States and massive corporations shaped the world economy through force and power. Yes, enormous fortunes were made. Cities like Amsterdam and London became incredibly wealthy. Banking and financial systems expanded rapidly, because as trade grew, finance grew with it. Ships were needed. Ships needed insurance. Insurance required capital. And very quickly, the issue stopped being just about trade. A gigantic system of money and power emerged. Trade was never simply about selling things. What truly mattered was having great power. And these systems were never neutral. Britain began presenting itself as the defender of free trade. Especially during the 1800s, Britain had become one of the world's largest industrial powers. It controlled the seas, stood at the center of the financial system, and directed much of global trade. Only then did they begin promoting the idea of free trade. But the important detail is this: Britain did not support free trade before becoming powerful. It supported it after it had already become one of the strongest nations on earth. First, it built its industries. Then it expanded its navy. After that, it controlled colonies. In other words, free trade did not make Britain powerful. Free trade benefited Britain because Britain was already powerful. Eventually, openness stopped being a risk and became a weapon, because Britain could already produce goods cheaper and at higher quality than most countries. As global markets opened, Britain gained the most. In short, free trade was not always the innocent idea it is often presented as. Sometimes it was simply an elegant way for powerful countries to present their own interests as something natural and universal. Throughout history, people have always admired powers that could disguise self-interest as a moral idea. Britain did this extremely well, but whenever someone challenged their system, things became far less polite. One of the biggest examples was the Opium Wars in the 1800s. At that time, there was enormous demand in Europe for Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk. But China had little interest in British products. As a result, Britain began running a massive trade deficit with China. Normally, the solution might have been to question its own economy. But Britain chose another path: opium. With government support, British merchants flooded China with huge amounts of opium. The goal was simple: to pull silver back out of China. When the Chinese government tried to stop the drug trade, Britain responded with warships. So sometimes what they called free trade was really just forcing markets open through military power. They were selling a product that devastated society, while defending it under the name of commercial freedom. If there were an award for hypocrisy in economic history, this event would rank near the top. By the late 1800s, the global economic system Britain had built looked incredibly powerful. There were steamships. There were undersea telegraph cables. The monetary system had become more organized. Capital moved rapidly between countries. Many people saw this as the triumph of globalization, but one critical detail was forgotten. This system depended entirely on a balance of power. The British Navy protected the sea routes. Britain stood at the center of global finance, and to a large extent, Britain made the rules. So open trade did not mean a world without power. On the contrary, power had become so normalized that people no longer even noticed it. Then, over time, the center of gravity of the world began to shift. And the United States entered the stage. In fact, America was not originally a completely free trade country either. On the contrary, many American economists believed that exposing a young industrial nation to immediate foreign competition would be dangerous. Alexander Hamilton explained this very clearly. If America truly wanted independence, it could not rely only on agriculture. It needed to build its own industries. But newly created industries could not immediately compete with giant foreign companies. So they needed protection. The logic was simple. The great European powers already had capital, factories, labor forces, and production networks. If America had fully opened its markets at that stage, it would not have entered a fair competition. It would have lost before the race even began. That is why the United States used high tariffs for many years. Especially after the Civil War, it implemented strong economic policies designed to protect domestic producers. And the result? Railroads expanded, factories multiplied, steel production exploded. By the early 1900s, the United States had transformed into a massive industrial power. But this did not happen purely because of a completely free market. It happened through state support, protective policies, infrastructure investments, and a huge internal market. So even though Britain and America are often portrayed as countries that discovered the truth of free trade, real history was far more complicated. The truth is that both Britain and the United States protected, supported, and strategically developed their economies for many years before becoming defenders of free trade. And throughout history, this pattern repeats itself again and again. Rising nations usually speak the language of strategy. Dominant nations begin speaking the language of principles. But most of the time, both serve the same purpose: protecting their own advantages. That does not mean trade is completely fake or everything is a lie. Trade truly did bring benefits. Larger markets can increase production. Competition can lower costs. Technology can spread. Living standards can rise. The problem is not the existence of trade itself. The problem is that the story we are told is often too clean. In books, trade is usually described as a simple exchange between equal countries under neutral rules. But the real world is far more complicated. There were power imbalances. There were political pressures. And the rules were usually written by those strong enough to protect themselves. Trade can make a country wealthier, but it can also make it dependent on outsiders. It can strengthen societies, but it can also hollow out their industries from within. Everything depends on these questions. Who is trading? Under what conditions? With how much power? And within what kind of system? This is where the most dangerous aspect of the modern world begins. Because once people start believing that trade is a completely neutral and self-operating system, they stop asking the most important questions. Who controls the sea routes? Who provides the money? Who writes the rules? Who pays the price during crises? Which countries lose their industries? Who becomes dependent on outsiders? Who controls the reserve currency? Who can impose sanctions on whom? These questions may sound less glamorous than supply and demand graphs, but in reality, they are far more important. After 1945, the United States was no longer just another major country emerging from war. It had become the center of the capitalist world. It possessed enormous gold reserves. The dollar began positioning itself at the center of the global system. The American Navy protected global trade routes. This is how the post-World War II economic order was built. The Bretton Woods system, the dollar system, international trade agreements. Everything looked more open and more free, and yes, trade expanded. Production increased. People gained access to more products, but this system did not emerge out of nowhere. Just as the old trade order depended on British power, the new order depended on American power. The dollar did not become the center of the world simply because it was the best currency. America's military strength, industrial capacity, banking system, and global influence made it possible. So behind modern globalization there was not only economics, there was military protection, there was financial power, there was geopolitical dominance. This is exactly the point many people miss about globalization. Today's cheap products and massive supply chains did not emerge only because of low tariffs. Underneath them stood a much harder system: military power, dollar dominance, legal structures, and the global balance of power. In other words, what looked like a natural economic order was actually an order built by major powers. Once you begin noticing this, many events in history stop looking like coincidences. By the late 1900s, global trade had expanded enormously. But this was not simply good economics defeating nationalism. In reality, a gigantic system was growing, one where some countries stood at the center while others were integrated into a structure they could never fully control. Yes, growth happened. But dependency also grew. Countries were constantly told, specialize according to your comparative advantage. It sounds elegant. But the real question is, specialize in what? Under whose monetary system? Protected by whose navy? Managed by which banks? Vulnerable to whose sanctions? If your role is to export low-value raw materials while importing high-tech products, then you are not entering the global economy as a VIP. You are entering from the back seat. That is why the effects of trade do not impact everyone equally. Consumers get cheaper goods. Corporations earn higher profits. Politicians market it as progress. But for workers, industrial cities, and developing nations, the situation can look very different. Factories do not close because work has become useless. They close because capital found a cheaper country. Some regions lose their industries entirely. Yet this is simply called efficiency. Countries open their markets before becoming economically strong. Then domestic companies collapse under pressure. And this is labeled modernization. In reality, this is an old system being presented in a modern and sophisticated way. Latin America became one of the clearest examples of this. Many countries were transformed into economies that mainly exported raw materials while importing high-value manufactured goods. The result? Dependence on external demand, debt crises, price shocks, and the inability to build strong industrial sectors. The problem was not trade itself. The problem was entering the system from a position of weakness and becoming trapped there. Because when a country continuously sells raw materials while being forced to buy products made by others, free trade begins to resemble assigned roles. Some produce, some provide raw materials, some print money, some borrow, some write the rules, some merely follow them. And just as the Western world began believing this system would last forever, China reminded everyone of something important. Trade is not a morality lesson. It is a power game. The rise of China became one of the biggest challenges to the globalization narrative. For years, Western countries believed, if China joins the global trade system, it will gradually become more liberal, more open, and more similar to the West. But that is not what happened. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Yet its rise was not built purely on free market ideology. It used state support. It implemented industrial policies. It aggressively expanded manufacturing. It gathered technology. It made enormous infrastructure investments. In other words, China entered the global market, but managed the process strategically from the very beginning. And this was not a minor detail. This was the real story. The greatest industrial rise in modern history did not happen through pure ideology. It happened through power, planning, and patience. Then factories began moving. Supply chains shifted. And gradually the world's manufacturing center moved toward China. China's rise was not caused only by cheap labor. Costs mattered. Massive production capacity mattered. Infrastructure mattered. But most importantly, the state could think in long-term strategic terms. Western countries appeared to win in the short term. Consumers bought cheaper products. Corporations earned greater profits. Politicians celebrated globalization as a success story. But during that same period, China was quietly building an extraordinary industrial machine. Electronics manufacturing, solar panels, battery systems, rare earth elements, logistics, and huge portions of industrial capacity gradually shifted into China's hands. And this is exactly where the old narrative began to crack. Because trade sounds wonderful, until your rival becomes indispensable. At that point, the conversation changes. Instead of efficiency, people begin talking about security. Instead of open economies, they talk about dependency risks. The system that was once praised suddenly begins to look dangerous because people realize something. Cheap imports are great until your rival manufactures the components for your medicines, weapon systems, energy technologies, and electronics. And so, free trade became a matter of national security. This is exactly the world we live in today. By 2026, almost nobody still believes trade is completely neutral. Now the world talks about sanctions, chip restrictions, domestic manufacturing, strategic minerals, supply chain security, and energy independence. Major powers no longer pretend that trade is separate from politics. They openly use trade as a geopolitical weapon. The United States restricts advanced chip exports. Europe tries to reduce external dependency. China uses its power in manufacturing and raw materials. Sea routes are now monitored not only for trade, but also for strategic risk. Because history returned. In truth, the old logic never disappeared. People simply forgot it during times of abundance. As long as sea routes were secure, energy flowed smoothly and products arrived quickly and cheaply. People assumed the system would last forever. But then came crises, wars, energy shocks, chip shortages, sanctions, and people remembered something once again. A system built entirely on external dependency and maximum efficiency is not strength. It is risk. When you look at history, the pattern is always the same. In the past, empires fought over spice routes. Later, industrial powers competed over trade routes and raw materials. Today, only the products have changed. The new spices are now chips, battery metals, rare earth elements, energy corridors, and data infrastructure. The old East India companies have been replaced by giant technology corporations, logistics networks, banks, and state-backed global firms. The old warships have been replaced by sanctions, export bans, and economic pressure. But the core of the system remains the same. Access is political. Dependency is dangerous, and no great power leaves the lifelines of its economy entirely to chance. And in the end, ordinary people always feel the effects. When trade systems become instruments of rivalry between nations, the consequences do not remain inside conference rooms. Everyone begins to feel them. Prices rise, product shortages appear, economic growth slows, inflation increases. People begin worrying about the future. A world built entirely on efficiency looks beautiful at first. Everything is cheap, fast, convenient. But when the system faces a crisis, the hidden cost of dependency appears. Energy prices surge. Shipping costs rise. Insurance costs increase. Countries begin supporting domestic production even if it becomes more expensive. And in the end, as always, ordinary people pay the bill. Then the discussion stops being theoretical and becomes reality, because people begin asking, who is secure in food supply? Who controls critical minerals? Who can still manufacture? Who controls the currency the world needs? Who can shut down technological flows? Who can survive a major supply crisis? That is why the phrase free trade no longer sounds as innocent as it once did. It now feels more like a comforting slogan from stable and prosperous times, because trade was never completely independent from power. At best, it functioned within strong and stable systems. At worst, it became a beautiful word used to decorate systems that left some nations dependent, devalued certain workers, and made some empires even richer. But the lesson should not be, trade is evil. That would be too simplistic. Trade can create growth. It can spread knowledge. It can improve living standards. It can connect societies, but it is never completely neutral. It always reflects the balance of power of its era. It rewards those who can write the rules, protect production, and shape the system itself. Everyone else is simply told to admire efficiency. So the next time politicians, economists, or major corporate leaders talk about trade as if it were a completely natural system that benefits everyone equally, remember the long story behind it. Remember the monopolies. Remember the colonial systems. Remember the opium wars. Remember the dollar system. Remember how fragile supply chains can be, and most importantly, never forget this. Behind open markets, there is often an invisible form of power. Because throughout history, trade has always followed power first, not theory, and that has never truly changed. If you want to learn the lessons of history, subscribe. Remember history.